By now, everyone knows the story of the JFK assassination. On October 2nd, 1963, a lone assassin named Thomas Arthur Vallee assassinated President Kennedy in Chicago, Illinois. The president was in Chicago to attend the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field, and he was assassinated as he... Hold up, what? That's not what happened. But it almost did. Everyone knows the story of Dallas, but few people know that 3 weeks before that, there was nearly an assassination attempt on JFK's life in Chicago. This is a crazy, crazy story that almost ended up being one of the most significant events in our country's history. And this isn't some conspiracy or rumor or theory or anything like that. There's official FBI reports and arrest records that back up this story, and over the years, the mainstream press has even occasionally mentioned it. It all began on Wednesday, October 30th, 1963, when the FBI received a call from an informant. This informant said there were 4 assassins in Chicago who were going to kill JFK while he was in town for the Army Air Force football game that weekend. JFK's trip was 3 days away when this call came in, and it set off a frantic citywide manhunt for these 4 assassins, and the Chicago Secret Service led the investigation. Now, one of the many interesting notes to this story is that the FBI informant who called in this tip only identified himself as Lee on the phone. Obviously, 3 weeks later, the name Lee would live in infamy when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder of JFK in Dallas. Over the years, it's been rumored that Lee Harvey Oswald was in fact an FBI informant, and this has led some to believe that the Lee who called the FBI about this Chicago plot was none other than Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, this has never been proven and the caller was never identified, but it's definitely a bit strange that he gave the name Lee. After this phone call from Lee, the Chicago Secret Service tore the city apart, and they eventually found 2 people in a boarding house on Clark and Division. These 2 people were found with high-powered rifles, scopes, and a Chicago map with the presidential route highlighted, which is, I don't know, maybe a little suspicious. These 2 men were brought in for questioning, but still to this day their identities are unknown. So that was 2 assassins off the street. But if Lee was right, there were 4 assassins in total, which meant 2 were still out there, and the president would be arriving in Chicago in 2 days. That next morning, things took another twist when a second phone call came in. This caller claimed that a Chicago resident named Thomas Arthur Vallee had been overheard threatening to kill JFK on his visit. The Chicago Secret Service was frantically trying to find the other 2 assassins on the loose, so they asked the Chicago police to find Thomas Arthur Vallee. The Chicago police assigned 2 officers, Daniel Groth and Charles Sherla, to, quote, get Vallee off the streets before the president's visit. And this is another strange twist to the story, because if you're a history buff, you might recognize the name Daniel Groth. 6 years later, in 1969, Groth became kind of a household name. He led the raid on Black Panther leader Fred Hampton's Chicago apartment that left Hampton and Mark Clark dead. The Fred Hampton case is very notorious. There's a ton out there about it. And the more you read about it, the more it really appears to be nothing less than a cold-blooded murder by the Chicago police and the FBI. At the time, Groth claimed the Black Panther leaders had fired multiple rounds at the Chicago police, which prompted the Chicago police to return fire and kill them. But it turned out that wasn't the case at all. A grand jury investigation in 1970 revealed that the Black Panthers had possibly fired 1 shot, while the Chicago police had fired almost 100 shots. Now, this is a truly odd coincidence. Of the tens of thousands of Chicago cops, the cop who was assigned to find Thomas Arthur Vallee is the exact same cop who led the raid on Fred Hampton's apartment years later. And there's a little more to the story too. During a trial after Hampton's death, Groth admitted under oath that he had led the raid on Hampton's apartment on behalf of the FBI. A researcher named Daniel Stern also uncovered that Groth frequently took training leaves to Washington, D.C. So why was this random Chicago cop taking training leaves to Washington, D.C.? It was suspected that Groth worked undercover jobs on behalf of the FBI and CIA while he was a Chicago cop, and these training leaves were actually FBI briefings. Now, obviously, this information is pretty explosive, and it gets even more interesting when we look at the timeline of events in the 24 hours before JFK's visit. As we mentioned, after the call about Thomas Arthur Vallee came in, Groth and Sherla were assigned to, quote, get Vallee off the street. It only took them a few hours to find Vallee at his boarding house on Paulina and Wilson. But instead of arresting him, the Chicago cops followed Vallee for almost 24 hours, and they didn't arrest him until 10:10 in the morning on the day of JFK's visit. When Thomas Arthur Vallee was arrested, police found 300 rounds of ammunition and 2 M1 rifles in his possession. In Washington, JFK's team was getting updates on the Chicago situation. On the morning of his visit, minutes before he was scheduled to fly to Chicago on Air Force One, they feared for his life and decided to cancel the trip, claiming JFK was busy with the situation in Vietnam. The decision to cancel would have come around 10 in the morning. And the interesting thing here is that it was only after JFK decided to cancel his trip that Groth and Shurla arrested Thomas Arthur Vallee. In other words, they followed Vallee around for almost 24 hours, could have arrested him at any point during this time, but instead only arrested him after JFK canceled his trip. This has led some to believe that Groth and Shurla's true mission wasn't to, quote, get Vallee off the street. If it was, they would have arrested him immediately, right after they found him. Instead, some believe the two cops were there to watch over Vallee until he carried out his task of assassinating JFK. The two cops were basically chaperones, assigned to keep an eye on Vallee until the assassination went down. But when JFK abruptly canceled his trip at the last minute, it threw the assassination plans into total disarray, and the cops' mission suddenly changed from chaperoning Vallee to arresting him and aborting the plan. Back in the day, this was a big controversy around the Chicago area for a while. The cops involved were heavily scrutinized, especially after Daniel Groth reappeared in the news when he led the raid on Fred Hampton years later. When questioned about any sort of connection to the FBI, Groth denied that he was a government agent. But keep in mind, this is the same guy who claimed the Chicago police had been bombarded by bullets from the Black Panthers during the Fred Hampton raid. This incredible story would have never been known if not for one person, Abraham Bolden. He was the first Black Secret Service agent assigned to presidential protection, personally appointed by JFK. After that, he transferred to the Chicago Secret Service office, and he was a key player in investigating this Chicago assassination plot. Now, when JFK was assassinated in Dallas 3 weeks later, the Warren Commission was formed to investigate the assassination. Their main task was determining if there was some sort of mysterious group of people involved in a plot to kill JFK in Dallas, or if the assassination was simply the work of one man, Lee Harvey Oswald. When Abraham Bolden read up on the Warren Commission, he was shocked to learn the commission wasn't even looking into a link between the Dallas assassination and the Chicago assassination plot. It seemed as if they weren't even aware of the fact that 3 weeks before Dallas, there was another near attempt on JFK's life in Chicago. So Bolden contacted J. Lee Rankin of the Warren Commission to inform him about the Chicago plot, and this ended up being a big mistake. At the time, the Warren Commission was portraying the Dallas assassination as a one-time event pulled off by a lone nut. It was all Lee Harvey Oswald, there was no one else involved, no grand conspiracy. But when Bolden told Rankin that only 3 weeks earlier, a similar assassination plot was nearly carried out by a team of assassins in Chicago, it completely contradicted the notion that Dallas was some random, one-time, isolated event. Someone clearly didn't want Bolden talking, because after he contacted the Warren Commission, Bolden was arrested, charged with accepting a bribe, and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Bolden claimed he was framed, and he's most likely right. He had been convicted on the word of 2 known counterfeiters. One of the counterfeiters, Joseph Spagnoli, later admitted in court that he had lied when testifying against Bolden. Unfortunately, Abraham Bolden spent almost 4 years in federal prison, and the Warren Commission mentioned nothing about the Chicago plot in their report on the Dallas assassination. In 2008, Bolden published an autobiography, The Echo from Dealey Plaza, in which he told his side of the story. The final interesting note about this Chicago plot are the remarkable number of similarities between Lee Harvey Oswald and Thomas Arthur Vallee. Both were former Marines who joined at around the same time. Both had served at Marine bases in Japan. The CIA was rumored to have a strong presence at both bases, making them prime recruiting stations. Both were involved with anti-Castro Cubans, Oswald in New Orleans, Vallee at a training camp on Long Island, New York. Both had recently started working at businesses that overlooked the routes of presidential parades. Oswald at the Texas School Book Depository on Elm Street in Dallas, and Vallee at IPP Lithoplate at 625 West Jackson Boulevard in Chicago. The lives of both men were also filled with mysterious connections to government agencies. There's long been rumors that Lee Harvey Oswald was an FBI informant, and when Thomas Arthur Vallee was arrested by Chicago police, he was driving a Ford Falcon with New York plates 31-10RF. An NBC Chicago reporter named Luke Christopher Hester ran the plates and the results came back. The license plates were frozen, and any information about the registration for Vallee's car was restricted to U.S. intelligence agencies. So, why was this supposed assassin driving around in a car with government-protected plates on it? Good question. JFK's planned route in Chicago was similar to his route in Dallas as well. In Chicago, he was to take the Northwest Expressway, later renamed the Kennedy Expressway, to downtown. He'd then take the Jackson Street exit, which was in a warehouse district right by the IPP lithoplate building where Vallee worked. The view from the IPP lithoplate building was virtually identical to the view from the Texas Schoolbook Depository, with both offering unobstructed views of Kennedy's car. This failed Chicago plot is more than just some interesting little side note in the JFK assassination story. The reason this Chicago plot is so significant is that it basically contradicts this notion that Lee Harvey Oswald was some lone nut assassin who acted all on his own and there was no one else involved. After all, if there were two separate plots to kill JFK within a 3-week span, that's either a heck of a coincidence or there truly was some sort of coordinated group of people who wanted him dead. Abraham Bolden has even said that's why he was framed and arrested, because he was one of the few people at the time who actually knew about this Chicago plot. And his information that there was a plot to kill Kennedy in Chicago right before Dallas contradicted the notion that Lee Harvey Oswald was some lone lunatic assassin. Had it not been for a few twists of fate, Chicago may have gone down in history as the site of JFK's assassination. The IPP lithoplate building would be forever remembered instead of the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and Thomas Arthur Vallee, not Lee Harvey Oswald, would be known as the most famous assassin in American history.